Holly blends her doctorate in law and master's in transpersonal counseling psychology to guide people and organizations from dominating and exploitative ways of being into attuned, transformative relationships. She lives and works in the threshold of collective grief and trauma, conscious collapse, and social democracy. She's most interested in social technologies such as ritual and deep democracy work that foster large-scale trauma resolution and collective nervous system regulation. Desiree is a spoken word poet, activist, and community organizer. She's currently working with the Ashland BIPOC Sanctuary to hold POC-led grief rituals. Desiree is finishing a master's of social work program through Portland State University, focusing on collapse psychology and radical social work futures. Most recently, she has been working with youth, exploring social and environmental justice, art as activism, and training young leaders to hold conversations about race.
I think I want to just lay out the general format of what we're going through so everyone kind of knows the terrain we're going to be exploring. So we're going to start with an opening poem and then a really short somatic centering practice. And then we'll do a brief overview of what Francis Weller calls the 5 gates of grief. This is from his book, The Wild Edge of Sorrow. Some of you may be really familiar. If not, I would definitely recommend it. And then we'll move into the 6th gate of grief, the harms we've done, which was first shared with me and us from my friend, Rachel Rice. And so here we'll be exploring a little bit of the terrain around regret and impact and harm. And then we'll either just introduce a short writing practice that you all can do, or if we have time, we'll do a little writing practice. So we'll see. And then there will be a closing poem. So that's where we're going to be headed. And yeah, Desiree, would you like to start with the poem?
Yeah. So this poem is called Public Grief. It's by an Indigenous writer, woman, whose name is Heidi E. Erdrich. This is not my grief, but a small hole, lightless, penetrating the globe of family. So now all stand still, ringed by light snow, ringed by bright lights. This is not my grief, but a lightless hole through the human globe, surrounded by cameras yammering, brilliant stills and stunned silence grown so loud it weighs down the flowers. Daisies, carnations, lilies, mums. All the flowers ever left in memorial, along with all the letters and petitions, and again the promise of never. This is not my grief, but a small hole, lightless, penetrating the light show, the weight of all the ever flowers, cameras, and microphones, speechless, unspeakable. There are no words, but words and words and words. This is not my grief, but a black and white vortex, a crush that collapses, sucks in, swallows whole. This is not my grief, but a terrible, particular, a small hole, deep beyond belief, deeper, deep enough to own its depth, to be depth alone.
Thanks, Desiree. I always love when you read poems, so. And I also want to say, John, I don't know if you still have the link to the Google Doc, but all the poems and books and whatnot that we're sharing, we have a Google Doc that we can share at some point. Maybe at the end, we'll drop it in the chat. So if there's anything, any quote or anything that you're into, just know that there will be a little outline of all of this. So I want to move into a little somatic centering practice. It's something that I learned from generative somatics, or I would say it's inspired by generative somatics, which there will be a little link to their website. And I learned this specifically around doing anti-racism, anti-oppression work which is important for me to say because a lot of when Desiree and I were designing this workshop was around anti-racism work and taking accountability for the harms that we've caused or are complicit in. So I encourage everybody just to get into a position where they're comfortable and where you have access to your body, particularly from the neck below. So that could be sitting, standing, laying down, whatever works best for you. And this centering practice is designed to help us center in dignity, belonging, safety, and presence. So I'm going to invite everybody to take a couple of deep breaths. And then we're going to start by centering in length. So moving down your body, possibly pushing your feet into the ground, feeling your weight, and then moving up through your spine, trying to make a little more space, maybe straightening out your neck, if that makes sense. And here we're centering in dignity. And so a question we can ask is, what can we do from this place of dignity? And next we're going to move to centering in width. And so I invite you just to widen a little bit in whatever way you can. That could be unfurling your shoulders, feeling the outside of your knees, just taking up a little bit more space, either physically or mentally. And then if it feels right, I invite you to imagine a friend ally on your right side. It could be someone from this congregation, maybe touching shoulders with you. And a friend ally on your left side, maybe touching shoulders with you as if you're standing in a circle. And maybe this is a specific person or just a presence. But what we're doing here is we're centering in belonging. And just noticing what it feels like to belong for a moment. And now we're going to center in depth. So I invite you all to feel your back body, maybe feeling the chair that your back is up against or the wall. And this is also a place where we notice who has our backs and who's come before us. So we recognize our elders, we recognize our ancestors, and just notice if there's anybody that comes to mind when you think about who has your back, who's there to help protect you. And as we take our next breath, we'll move through our body, through our organs, to our front body, possibly to our belly button, and then in front of us, recognizing future generations. That's part of the reason why we're here doing this work. And by centering in our depth and recognizing who has our backs and who's in front of us, we're centering in safety. And then we're just going to come back to our bodies, back to our center. This could be our belly button for some of us. This could be around our heart for some of us. Wherever feels most centered to you. And just taking a couple deep breaths in this place of center. noticing if there's any part of your body that needs attention for one more moment. And then as it feels right in your next couple breaths, coming back into the room and back to the screen. Thank you, everyone. I hope that we're all feeling a little more centered and grounded with that. And Desiree, are you open to introducing the first gate of grief?
Yes, thank you for that, Holly. That was
Yeah.
good for me. Yeah, so we're going to jump into the 5 gates of grief and kind of going through an overview. First gate is kind of what we traditionally think of when we think of grief and loss. So the death of a loved one, suicide, losing a job, a house, or an illness. It's the understanding that all things in life are impermanent. So often this kind of loss in the first gate changes the way we view the world. As we're confronted with fear and uncertainty, the grief of endings can also be an initiation to mark new beginnings. So in The Wild Edge of Sorrow, Francis Weller writes, "My grief says I have dared to love, that I allowed another to enter the very core of my being and find a home in my heart. Grief is akin to praise. To love is to accept the rights of grief." So he's talking here about how grief can teach us to love more deeply and to experience the depth of gratitude for what it is we love. If we try to avoid grief, it can stagnate and become more of a weight or a burden. But if we're willing to meet our grief, we can find a new capacity and experience the fullness of beauty and pain, sweet and the bitter. So the grief of impermanence opens space for all of our emotions and for us to be more fully alive. So for myself right now, I'm really feeling how this first gate is enmeshed with the other gates. Everything we're experiencing in the collective feels really tied to the personal. And since COVID, I haven't been able to work, as an example, as a single mom. This has been a huge source of stress and grief and the unknown, how to provide for my girl in these times, and it feels overwhelming. Holly, I'm curious for you, as we're talking about personal loss, what comes up in this first gate?
Yeah, for me, it's pretty traditional. Loss through death. I have 2 siblings, Ivy and Brett, who have both passed away, and so this is a pretty familiar gate for me.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm sure all of us have experienced deep loss, and just want to invite everyone to sit for a few moments in remembrance of that. If you feel called to share a grief you've experienced in the chat, a person, a place, a job, or an illness, feel free to share with the group.
Thanks, Desiree. We'll be keeping our eye on the chat, so if anybody does drop anything in there, we'll be watching it, and we'll either read those out loud if it makes sense with where we're at, or we'll certainly be witnessing it, just so everybody knows. So we're going to move to the second gate of grief, and this is the places that have not known love. So this gate refers to the aspects of ourselves that we deny in order to fit into our family, our peer groups, and the broader cultural systems. These are the places that are either personally marginalized in us or marginalized in the wider culture. So in Kai-Ching Tom's book, I Hope We Choose Love, A Trans Girl's Notes from the End of the World, which is a great book, and is also in the Google Doc, she says, "When you're a child trapped in a situation of physical or psychological deprivation, you learn shame as an efficient, elegant mechanism of survival. And," then she says, "yet normalcy in this era of advanced capitalism, class warfare, and political instability is a loaded concept that comes with an oft forgotten history of oppression. Here, in the colonized West, the standard for a normal life is not only cisgender, but also white, middle class, monogamous, abled, and, I'm paraphrasing here, heterosexual. So again, this is the gate where we can really recognize that there's parts of us that weren't tended to and weren't cared for a lot of different reasons. And an example for me around this is the parts of me that I would call sort of like witchy and weird, maybe animistic, the parts of me that knew that there was something, some other way to connect and some other language being spoken, but that in my family and in mainstream culture was really like tampered down. I'm curious for you, Desiree, what you think of when you think about the second gate of grief.
Yeah, it's pretty similar, actually, the weird witchy self. Kind of feel like I've always been a little different from my family, and there's a lot of grief for me around when I'm true to myself, the disappointment or judgment or anger for expectations not fulfilled. And
yeah. It also makes me think about a lot of the conversations we've had, Desiree, or just having with other femme people around how unacceptable holy outrage or anger feels, and that those parts of us that aren't maybe quiet are often rejected and put into the second gate of grief. And so I invite you all to think about what part of you has been marginalized. What part of you do you feel like you've had to deny or oppress in order to fit in? And as we're sitting in this, I want to just take a moment to recognize and pay attention to that part of us. See if there's anything that it's wanting, needing, asking for. And if it feels right or helpful, feel free to drop that part of you in the chat. Yeah, I see that. I think about the parts of me that don't fit stereotypical male emotions of anger, triumph, and desire. Yeah. And I bet both by the overculture and by, personal relationships, those weren't really fully accepted. So, yeah, I might lose my car due to a scary accident. Yeah, that's in that first gate for sure. Yeah. Thank you. And I think the rage against injustice can certainly go in this second gate and also enters into this third gate that we're about to explore really well.
Yeah. So the third gate is the sorrows of the world. And this is really our first step into collective grief. These are the losses that we share. It's really showing up for us right now in earth grief that so many of us are experiencing as we're observing the destruction of land, pollution, species being lost to extinction. We're currently, as Holly mentioned in our opening, bearing witness to the collapse of our social, political, economic, cultural, environmental systems. There's collective trauma and heaviness here, even as we just reflect on the last year. Global pandemic, racial injustice and uprising, economic downturns, climate crisis. So grief, outrage, fear, despair, overwhelm are all really common emotions when we tap into the sorrows of the world. In the movement for Black lives, we're also seeing the sorrows of the world in white supremacy, capitalism, colonization, a system that's divided and harmed all of us. But this gate also really helps us remember the longing of our wild souls. When we invite the sorrows of the world into our heart, we're reunited, reconnected to the body of the earth. So we remember that the land is alive and the land grieves, and that we have a responsibility to grieve with it. So when we remember this deep and constant connection to the earth and each other, And when we're able to grieve together, this collective pain, we can also start healing together. So for myself right now, I'm really grieving how white supremacy has taken its toll on my personal relationships and my family, sometimes driving me further apart from people I love. I'm grieving my daughter's future on this planet, the systems I both have to teach and unteach her, and the feeling of helplessness that comes with that. Holly, I'm wondering for you, what are some of the sorrows of the world you're feeling most deeply?
Yeah, I really appreciate all you shared there, Desiree. And for me, it also has to do with just watching how white supremacy causes bodily harm and violence to Black, Indigenous, and people of color, and how it also keeps me and my white skin Ken from being fully human. And then also just really watching the wildfires in California. I have a lot of friends out there, some of which are evacuated right now. And then there's also fires in Colorado where I'm at. And none are super close to my house, but there's a lot of smoke, and just really recognizing that while fire is natural in a lot of ways, the way that it's happening isn't natural, and is causing a lot of harm to the land, the places that I love.
Yeah, thank you for naming that. It's pretty big. So as we contemplate this body of the earth, invite you to feel into your own body, where you're carrying this collective grief and pain. Maybe bring to mind one specific thread of grief, piece of land, a story you heard, or an image. And feel free to share in the chat if you'd like. We'll be watching that. And I see someone shared, I feel the loss of thickness, wild nature around me, birds, insects, butterflies, fireflies. Yeah. Thank you.
And so now, oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, we're going to move to the fourth gate.
Yeah. So the fourth gate of grief is what we expected and did not receive. So what this has to do with, how Francis Weller talks about this, is the expectations that are coded into our physical and psychic lives from having lived in deep, rich, embedded, intertwined community for thousands and thousands of years. So we evolved in relational environments and societies. And the contrast to our domesticated, civilized lives now is so extreme, and yet we seldom have the language or space to acknowledge this grief, the grief of having lost community, the grief of somewhere in our beings expecting to wake up with 20 sets of eyes asking us, like, Desiree, what did you dream last night? And usually we're lucky if we have one other set of eyes saying, like, hey, how are you? Gotta take out the trash, something like that. So this is really the gate of grief. It's not just the human community that we've lost, it's also the intertwined or embedded nature of being with animal and plant kin all the time. So in Mia Birdsong's book, How We Show Up, which is a really good book, anyone who's interested in how to build community and connection, I would very much recommend it. She writes, all of us have ancestral memory of what it's like to live connected, interdependent lives. We may be cut off or too far away from those traditions to claim them, but we can listen to our needs, our longings, and through ritual, rite, and practice, build a way of being in the world that honors and makes tangible our connections to one another, to natures, and to spirits. So this is really that gate of the interwovenness and the tapestry of all that is the human and more than human world being such a part of us and having lost that. So for me, I really feel this around Desiree, as you know, we Desiree and I and a few other folks were building a local community group that met several times a week and shared food and dreams and ritual. And we were really trying to find a place we could be on land together. And we just didn't have the resources. We, both financially and also just timing wise, really recognizing the ways that late stage capitalism keeps us from even having the space to connect with one another. And so that's something that happened about 1.5 years ago. And it's something I deeply feel around. And so, Desiree, I'm curious for you, any examples and thoughts around this fourth gate of grief?
Yeah, I share that one. Definitely community. As I mentioned, being a single mother, raising my daughter alone, grieving the idea of family that I thought I'd have, or just more cohesion in what that looks like with co-parents. And yeah, it seems like isolation and exhaustion are parts of this for me.
Yeah, that makes sense. Me too. Yeah, so I want to invite everybody to just think about the ways in which you don't feel supported by a community, and how does that feel? Where do you feel that in your body? And if it feels right, feel free to share a couple words about how it feels when we think about this fourth gate of grief. I see that someone wrote around this loss of expectation, that I'd received physical and emotional affection from my father. Yeah, and grieving deeply that there's so few willing to truly live sustainably and surrender their sense of entitlement. Yeah. Yeah, frustration trying to build communities. Yeah, only to find the people fighting with each other until they've fractured. I feel that too, like the ways in which we don't even have the skills to live in a really connected nature with each other. Like, and I feel that especially like in my throat, with like a knot in my throat and just tension in my chest, and some heaviness around this fourth gate of grief. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Holly. We're going to move into the fifth gate, which is ancestral grief. And so this gate really speaks to the sorrows of our lineage and ancestors, those that came before us. So this is grief we carry in our families, as well as within our own bodies and psyches. So much of song, myth, and ritual today isn't really focused on developing those relationships with ancestors. It's not essential. And so there are cultural wounds that are passed on through generations, and it's a burden we have without really always having the context for this pain. So the grief of Black, Indigenous, people of color right now are teaching us how the wounds of colonization are playing out in racialized trauma, and oppression, injustice. And there's generations where this pain has been unattended, both for Black and brown bodies and for white folks. So we're seeing the impact of genocide and slavery in this country that this country was built on isn't really something we can ignore any longer. So connecting with ancestral grief means tracing our own lineage back to what sorrows and burdens, what loss, wrongdoings have been silenced or ignored and acknowledged. And ancestral grief sometimes wants to stay hidden, but when we bear witness, it begins to move. Resmaa Menakem, author of My Grandmother's Hands, talks about cleaning our pain. He says, all of this suggests that one of the best things we can do, not only for ourselves, but also for our children and grandchildren, is to metabolize our pain and heal our trauma. When we heal and make more room for growth in our nervous systems, when we don't address trauma, we may pass it on to future generations, along with some of our fear, constriction, and dirty pain. So for myself, my family was from Goa, which was colonized by the Portuguese 400 years ago. And I can feel the thread of my ancestral grief in watching my family in patterns. They immigrated to this country and in the 70s and have been in many ways trying to fit into the dominant culture. And so there's patterns of worrying, rule following, trying to rise in status and wealth to stay safe that I see. And then I notice those in myself too, as my own internal fears and urgency and need to control. But it's something that's larger and older than myself. Something that's not just mine, but is also connected to my ancestors. Holly, I'm wondering for you, what's your experience of ancestral grief?
Oh, yeah. It's really nuanced and deep for me, as I'm sure it is for everybody. But certainly on one side, I feel responsibility and grief around being white and being the ancestor of slave owners, and recognizing how domination and supremacy have been such a significant part of my ancestral line, such a significant part of how my ancestors survived and the cost of that to other people, and also to my ancestors' humanity, and how we interact with everyone and each other. So there's that piece. And then I also feel, being a femme person, being a woman in this world, I really feel the memory of the witch burnings. And I think most women, most femme people have some memory held in their DNA around the witch burnings or around exposure and not speaking up. And so I feel like those are both places that I'm healing in different ways and feeling grief in this fifth gate. So, yeah.
Yeah, appreciate the complexity of that. So for this moment, I just want to invite us all to maybe take a breath and let yourself touch this vast realm of grief that stretches back generations. And what wounded areas in this ancestral realm want to be tended? Is there an ancestor, part of your lineage, that feels present with you right now? What does that feel like? Just take a moment to breathe here.
Yeah, and I notice in this gate too, like confusion. I think until recently, we've had so few words for it and so little ritual or acknowledgement around this. I mean, now we have words like epigenetic trauma or ancestral trauma or ancestral grief, but I don't know, for me, that's all been new languaging in the last, I'd say, 5 to 10 years. And so I just want to recognize that confusion piece too. And also really, I see in the chat just people, talking about not knowing grandparents or, people dying early in their lineage. Patriarchy and grief of starvation and of ancestors in Ireland. Yep, I get that. The loss of goddess in mainstream culture and religions. Shout out to Charlene Spretnak, who writes really amazing stuff around this. And I was really astounded when I read some of the early myths, Greek myths, and what they're really like, rather than the patriarchal forms of them. This is I really appreciate what everybody's written here. Is there anything else you'd like to add, Desiree, before we move into the sixth gate?
No.
Awesome. Okay. So we've just pretty quickly gone over the terrain of these 5 gates, and I hope that this is giving people a framework to really work with grief beyond even just the kind of first gate, that the grief that we acknowledge in this culture, which even that is fairly limited when we do acknowledge grief. So really, this is a framework with which we can give words to what I think a lot of us are experiencing. And then, as I said before, one of my friends, Rachel Rice, who does a lot of anti-oppression work, anti-racism work, and noticed and gave words to this 6th gate of grief, which she calls the harms we've done or are doing. And so this can be personal harm we've caused. So, if we're in intimate relationship with a friend, a partner, often we cause harm. We don't mean to, but we do. We just miss them, or we're having a bad day, or we just don't have the skills to really navigate the challenges of relationship. And so this can also be collective harm that we've caused and or that we're complicit in. I think that, I know that this gate was really born from conversations around anti-racism work and around how, like as a white person, I benefit from white supremacy, and it causes harm, and I'm trying to disconnect from so many of these oppressive systems, but it's difficult. And there's so many ways in which I think we don't want to recognize this. And so here we're just really trying to explore with as much compassion as possible the ways that we're causing harm. And so for me, as someone with power, privilege, advantage, I feel like one way that I've caused harm is by really overestimating my capacity in projects. And so as like a white-bodied person and someone who's financially stable, I can say, oh, I can do that, I can handle that. And then if I can't, or if an event gets canceled or something, I usually end up okay. And someone else who doesn't have white skin privilege, or who doesn't have money, might not recover as easily. And so that's something that I've had to really look at, my own sense of urgency or entitlement that kind of makes me be like, oh, I can do that, I can do this. And so that's just one way that I know that I've caused harm, and certainly in personal relationships too, which I'll actually talk about a little bit when I talk in the service. I'm curious for you, Desiree, any thoughts or examples in this 6th gate of grief?
Yeah, I definitely think about my relationship with the earth, and often it feels like I can't exist without contributing to the destruction of our planet. Constantly consuming or polluting or upholding harmful systems, whether I mean to or not. And also in personal relationships, just harm I've done with my words, meanness or defense. But I also really appreciate the 6th gate and the complexity of it, as with my identity as a woman of color, and feel like it's relevant to kind of flip that on its head as well, and the other experience of what it's like to have harm done to me when we're looking in this systemic context. So by living in the systems we do, where as a woman of color, it's common to feel overlooked, or like my gifts aren't always recognized, because the dominant culture tends to center white-bodied people. So yeah, leaning into intergenerational trauma and in my own ancestral wounds and the harm that colonization has caused there. The disconnect with my own indigenous roots is something that I think about in the 6th gate a lot.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. I know, well, there's 2 things here. One is I really appreciate the way that Frances and then Rachel laid out these gates of grief, because of course they're interconnected, but it's like as we step into one, it helps us to actually step into the next one. And so it's really fitted to me that the fifth gate of ancestral grief then leads into this sixth gate of the harms we've done. And I hear you talking about that. And I also know that as you and I were putting this workshop together, we talked a lot about like, how do we hold this both for Black, Indigenous people of color and for white people? Not that Black, Indigenous people of color never cause harm, but that it's a nuanced conversation. And that what we really want is, yes, for everybody to be able to take compassionate accountability, but also for people with more power and advantage to really look at how being complicit in these systems causes harm, and that it's just different work to do in some ways. And there's a quote by Adrienne Marie Brown, the author of Emergent Strategy and Pleasure Activism, that just sums this up really beautifully. She says, "Where we are born into privilege, we are charged with dismantling any myth of supremacy. Where we are born into struggle, we are charged with claiming our dignity, joy, and liberation." And so that feels really succinct and beautiful to me around this. Is there anything else you'd like to add, Desiree, before we move into the sort of prompt here?
No.
Awesome. Yeah, and thanks for sharing. I mean, I know that this is really both personal and not, right? And so I recognize how much you've shared with me and are sharing with the group, and how much people even in the chat are sharing. So I appreciate it. And yeah, so as we explore the sixth gate of grief, a lot of times we'll do a writing practice. Today, we're not going to do the full writing practice. I'm going to outline what it is, and then we'll do a really short form just to sit with some of the words that we offer people. So in the Google Doc that John put in there in the chat, and I'm sure we can share it again through email or anything, it really outlines this practice even more. But this is basically sort of an unconscious writing practice where we just let words flow. And so there's this format, and usually we'll set a timer for 10 minutes. The time, whatever it is, it's just a set amount of time. 10 minutes is recommended. And when the timer starts, you start writing and you don't pick your pen up. And when the timer stops, you lift your pen up at whatever word you're at. You don't finish the sentence or anything. And so what happens here is you'll be given prompts. And so the prompts that we recommend in this sixth gate of grief are, I deeply regret. I deeply regret. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. And I hurt. I hurt. And so what this could look like in this practice is you'll be writing, and if you get stuck, you'll actually move back to the prompt. So if you're using I deeply regret, it could look like I deeply regret, I deeply regret, I deeply regret, and then something comes and you'll continue to write. And so then typically we share these, and when there's like a really important rule, which is when you're sharing this, the person who's the listener just simply says thank you, and the person who's sharing just simply says you're welcome. So that builds a lot of safety for people, knowing that, you know, there's just going to be gratitude and there's not going to be critique around this. Again, that's also outlined really well in the Google Doc. But what we're going to do today is, rather than doing the full writing prompt, just taking a moment, maybe shutting your eyes if that feels right and safe, or lowering your gaze. And I'm just going to say one of the prompts and just simply see what comes up for you, if there's a name, concept, face. So, I deeply regret. And maybe say it to yourself after I say it. I deeply regret. We'll just take a couple more breaths into that place of regret. And I know that wasn't much time at all, so I really invite people to engage in the writing prompt. And if you want to share it with somebody and you don't have anybody that you want to share it with in the congregation or in your life, feel free to drop us an email. Pretty open to witnessing that when people really want to engage with grief. So if there's anything that came up for you around that you want to drop into the chat, feel free. And I think for me, I just noticed in that moment, like a real tightening in my throat and almost a sense of overwhelm as I was kind of feeling into that place of regret. I'm curious for you, Desiree, if anything came up or if there's anything else you want to add before we move into closing.
Yeah, just the weight of it. I feel it's difficult or tender to kind of to touch that place and be like, oh wow. So leaning in, yeah, just feel the weight of that. Yeah. So we are moving to the end of our workshop, and we're really grateful that you joined. This is tender and hard, so thank you all for being willing to explore this terrain of grief. Complexity of this concept of harm, especially as it pertains to our world right now, is uncomfortable, but it's also necessary for our collective remembering and liberation. So we just want to thank Frances Weller for permission to share these 5 gates of grief, and to Rachel Rice for articulating the 6th gate, recognizing the immense grief that is that lives in systems of dominance and oppression. So hopefully this has been helpful. We would love any feedback also about this presentation, 6th gate of grief, or any other thoughts you'd like to share. You can contact us, I think in the doc, our email is tendingthethreshold@gmail.com. And we're also likely going to be offering a deeper dive workshop into the 6th gate of grief, exploring more in-depth racialized trauma through dominant identities, and hopefully making this a space that is safe for BIPOC folks to join. So we'll likely have affinity groups to explore this idea of harm. So you can email us for more details on that. And thank you, Holly. I always appreciate working with you. I know you're going to end with a poem, but was there anything else you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, I just appreciate you too. I love working with you and just seeing everybody here and seeing people engage. It's always an honor. I do want to say we host a live vigil online every month around the new moon. So I think this coming month, it's September 17th at 6 o'clock Pacific time. There's info in the Google Doc. It's free, it's open to the public. And so that's one way to really sit with grief with other people. And yeah, I want to close with a poem with words from Adrienne Marie Brown. This is part of a larger poem, and I'm going to just read the last part of it. So it's called Spell for Grief or Letting Go by Adrienne Marie Brown. Remember, you are water. Of course you leave salt trails. Of course you are crying. Flow. P.S. If there happens to be a multitude of griefs upon you, individual and collective, or fast and slow, or small and large, add equal parts of these considerations. That the broken heart can cover more territory. That perhaps love can only be as large as grief demands. That grief is the growing up of the heart that bursts boundaries like an old skin or a finished life. That grief is gratitude. That water seeks scale, that even your tears seek the recognition of community. That the heart is a front line and the fight is to feel in a world of distraction, that death might be the only freedom, that your grief is a worthwhile use of your time, that your body will feel only as much as it is able to, that the ones you grieve may be grieving you, that the sacred comes from the limitations, and that you are excellent at loving. So thank you. Oh yeah, thank you.